Tonight is lesson 7 in our study. All the men and women of the Bible, alphabetical order. We managed to get through Abraham in one night, so that means we're on Absalom. And Absalom's story is a sad story. Partly Absalom himself, partly because of some of the other characters involved. But 2 Samuel 13 through 2 Samuel 18 is pretty much covers the whole Absalom saga. And Absalom was David's third son, King David's third son by his fourth or maybe third wife, which is going to play a role in this. Polygamy definitely plays a role in Absalom's, what ended up happening in his life. I went through and looked at tried to find all the wives of David in the order of their appearance. And I've got Absalom's mother as number 4, but some others, at least one person that's probably or certainly much smarter than I am, had her as his third wife. So I'm not sure which one. Her name was Maacah. And this is just a fascinating, it's like Shakespeare couldn't come up with this. The king of tragedy could not come up with, he couldn't have written it any better, at least, more tragic. Just the whole, especially chapter 13, maybe I shouldn't say especially, but chapter 13 is really where it all gets set up and starts. And really Absalom, to understand Absalom's story, we have to also throw in Amnon, who is his half-brother. So 2 Samuel 13 begins by introducing us to Absalom, but the first half of the chapter doesn't really deal with Absalom. It deals with Amnon and Absalom's sister. So it starts and says, "Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her." Now already we got to untangle some stuff here. Absalom is said to be David's son who had a beautiful sister, Tamar. All right, not confusing yet. It's pretty simple. But then it says, after a time, Amnon loved her, but Amnon is also said to be David's son. What's going on here? Well, Absalom and Tamar were full-blooded siblings. All three of the people mentioned in verse 1 are they're all David's children. Absalom and Tamar have the same mother, Maacah. Amnon is their half-brother. And which one is his mother slips my mind at the moment. I want to say, actually I probably shouldn't even say, it's one of the A word ones, I think. But that's not really important here. What's important is that he is their half-brother, and that Tamar was Absalom's full sister. Now we don't make that distinction to cut Amnon what's going to happen to cut him any slack, because it doesn't cut him any slack. But it does help us to understand Absalom and Tamar's connection. Okay, that's the one I was thinking of, but I was not sure, so thank you. Yep. Yes. So, different mother, same father, but Absalom and Tamar had the same mother, as well as David being their father. So, that sets it up in verse 1. Amnon is quite a character himself. Amnon, verse 2, was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar. For she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. The reader might at this point think, well, duh. Of course it seemed impossible, because it should be impossible. And he shouldn't even be, here is already we see some of the woes that can come from polygamous arrangements. Now, that's not to say that in our culture, a half-brother and a half-sister are going to even get to the point where they would even come near this situation. But nevertheless, that could be, you could make the case that that is the root of what happens in 2 Samuel 13. Because Absalom didn't have any infatuation with his sister Tamar. So there is something to be said. But the main thing to be said about this is what kind of wicked, petulant creature Amnon is, who was the oldest, the firstborn. Now it says, okay, so we're introduced to the characters. Amnon is making himself sick because he is obsessed with Tamar. But he knew that nothing would ever come of it. But Amnon had a friend, okay? That's another turning point in this. But Amnon had a friend, okay? This friend happened to be his cousin. But he had a friend, Jonadab, and again, talk about a character. He was some kind of character, slick kind of guy. The Bible calls him a very crafty man. He came up with a plot for Amnon to get his wish. What kind of sick freak, if you'll pardon my French, would do that? Instead of, a real friend would say, Amnon, you need help. This is ridiculous. You should not be looking at your sister like this at all, especially to this point. But instead, he comes up with a way for him to be able to take his sister's virginity. It's just absolutely horrendous to even think about. But this is a very important part of what really sets Absalom ablaze and what really starts this fire. So here was the plot. Pretend you're sick, and after the custom of a loved one or whatever coming in and making food for them, manipulate the events to where you get Tamar to be the one who's going to do that, and then he's going to end up having her do it in his room, not just in his house or apartments, but in his actual room, and feed him by hand, and he's going to be able then to force his sister. He's going to have her in a spot where she can't get away. That's what he ends up doing. And first of all, we'll point out Amnon, David comes to see him, laying down, faking sick, and he says, please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight that I may eat from her hand. And David says to his servant, some servant, he says, all right, go get Tamar and tell her to come in here and help her brother. I think that's another piece of this that we're going to learn some lessons from, even though it has nothing to do with Amnon or Absalom. We're going to learn some lessons from David too in this. Positive lessons because of negative decisions. David probably should have thought twice and, stopped and thought, wait a minute, this is weird. No, that's silly. There's no point in that. And it's weird besides, but no, he just, go get her and let's do this. So that's what ends up happening. Amnon she tries to reason with him. First of all, she appeals to morality. She said this is such a thing that is that's not done in Israel. And then she said, don't do this outrageous thing. Then she said, as for me, then she sort of appeals to mercy and pity. She said, as for me, where could I carry my shame if you did this? And then she tries to talk sense. She says, as for you, you'd be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, then she gets desperate. She says, now just go ask Dad, and he won't keep me from you, so you can have me. She knew that wasn't true, but now she's desperate. He wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he violated her and he stole her virginity, his virgin sister. And by the way, things were different back then. Virginity was, being intact was extremely important for a young lady, because if it wasn't, she's not going to get married, ever. So that's what she tried to appeal to him for, was if you do this, this is going to have permanent, irreparable damage to me. It won't to him, but it will to her. He did not care. And if that wasn't bad enough, verse 15 really takes the cake. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. It's a good example of the deceitfulness of sin, I think. Hebrews 3:13 talks about the deceitfulness of sin. Amnon got what he wanted, and now guess what? It's over. He don't even want to look at it. Over and done. Now she appeals to him again. He says, go, get out of here. She says, no, this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me. That's how bad that what he was doing had hurt her. Think about what he had just done to her. And she says, this is even worse. Because it's, cruel on top of cruelty that he's already showed. So, again, he wouldn't listen. And then he called a servant and said, get this woman out of my presence. Get her out of here. Drag her out of here and bolt the door after her. It says she was wearing a long robe. By the way, if you're interested, a little side note. Verse 18 is the word, the Hebrew word, is the same as the thing that Jacob made for Joseph. That's infamously called a coat of many colors. This is the verse where that same word is used to describe this long robe with sleeves. That's whatever this thing was, similar to what Jacob made for Joseph. But in this case, it was a special garment that the virgin daughters of the king wore. But guess what? She's not a virgin daughter of the king anymore. She put ashes on her head, tore that long robe, laid her hands on her head, and went away crying aloud as she went. This was a broken woman, destroyed young woman. So then, now Absalom comes back into the picture. It says her brother Absalom tried to console her. It doesn't sound very consoling if you read it, but that's what he's doing. We can't hear it, we can't see it, so it may be difficult for us to really grasp it. But that's what he was doing, was trying to console her. He's saying, don't lay it to heart, hold your peace. But the important part of verse 20 is that it says, so Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. That word lived there, the verb, carries the idea of ever after. She lived the rest of her days, a desolate woman. All because of Amnon. Now, Absalom so far is a hero, isn't he? He's a hero right now. He was her brother. He has taken her in. He's tried to console her. Now she's going to live with him. More or less, whatever that arrangement would entail. She lived in her brother Absalom's house. So Absalom's a hero for now, but don't get too excited, because his heroism ends after this, as far as a moral person is concerned. Many people would read the rest of chapter 13 and still think he's a hero, but not so much. Now here's one of the most shocking parts of the whole story. Now you can already see it on the screen, but just pretend like you have no idea what verse 21 says, and you started to read these words. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. That's it. That's the end of the verse. Now, this is not only the king, but he is the father of both of the parties involved. And he heard about all of it. He heard about it. That his son raped his daughter, and then everything else. But what did he do when he heard about it? Nothing. He just got mad. That was it. That was a big, big part. Verse 21 is a crucial key to what ends up happening next. Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon. And naturally so, I would say, because he had violated his sister Tamar. Now that sets the stage for Absalom's life cycle from this point for the rest of his life. And the next few words, and by the way, does this remind you of anybody? Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated him. It reminds me of Joseph and his brothers. Remember, we read they could not speak peaceably to Joseph because they hated him so bad. So they couldn't talk. They just didn't talk to him at all because they hated him so badly. Absalom and Amnon, their relationship, that's where they are. And Absalom, like we said, he was the third. The one in between isn't really, he pretty much hardly never shows up in the narrative, in the whole Old Testament narrative. So Absalom, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much the second son. So here's what we read next. After 2 full years, so think about where verse 22 left off. Amnon did this to Tamar. David finds out about it. David does absolutely nothing to Amnon. I mean, he should have been punished. He should have been killed. He should have been executed. But he didn't even get so much as a slap on the wrist. So David failed here as a king and as a father. He already failed as a father as far as I'm concerned in verse 7, when he didn't even think twice about the whole situation and how it seemed a little strange. But now he really failed as a father and a king in verse 21. So 2 years pass. Guess who still is walking around like nothing ever happened? Amnon. And David, for that matter, I guess. So after 2 full years, Absalom probably had waited for justice for 2 years, or for a long time. But after 2 years, he had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor. It's hard for us to comprehend what that is because we don't have anything like this, but this was a very festive time. This was an important time for shepherding people. Sheep shearer. He had sheep shearers. They were going to celebrate. They were going to have a big party, a big celebration. Absalom, this is his moment. As he has created for himself. He invited all the king's sons, okay? Now, 2 years is a long time. All that stuff in the first half of chapter 13 is 2 years ago that happened. Presumably was never brought up, he got away with it, and it's over.
But Absalom had to see their sister every day. She lives with him,
Yeah.
whatever.
They're very close. Yeah, they are very close. We don't see Tamar again. The last picture we have of her is in verse 20, that she lived ever after a desolate woman. And so, but she's with Absalom. So Absalom would have been dealing with her and seeing her, how broken, and even if she was still cheerful, I mean, even if she found, cheer in anything or joy, she was still alone. So, and why is she alone? Because of Amnon. So even if she made all kinds of peace with it, even if she made peace directly with Amnon about it, no matter what the circumstances were, she was still alone and would be for the rest of her life, and all because of Amnon. So now this opportunity comes. Absalom invites all the king's sons, and then he goes to Dad, David, and he says, hey, why don't you come too? All the king's sons, you come. Now, Absalom knew David was not going to come. King David, it's not really, the likelihood of him coming was not much. But I think Absalom knew that. And so whenever he said, no, I'm not going to come, but you have my blessing, and Absalom then, he said, okay, well, if you won't come, at least let my brother Amnon come. Now again, even though 2 years passed, David knew about everything that happened before, and I'm assuming that he probably knew about Absalom, kind of going in and sweeping in there and being the hero there, and he certainly would have known about Absalom's connection with Tamar as, children from the same wife of David. And this still, again, didn't throw up any red flags for David. Why would he single out Why? Amnon. Wait a minute. Something's going on here. What do you got up your sleeve? But the closest he got to that was, why should Amnon go? But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon go.
I would say that there were maybe some alarms going off with David, but because of Absalom's persistence and maybe his smooth talk, persuaded him.
Yeah, that could be what verse 27 is indicating, because, that is one of Absalom's strong suits. Was he was a charm. He had charm, and he was good looking. Not that David would care about that, but he had a way of influencing people. Dean?
Well, too, that with David in his past, he might be seeing himself in what Amnon did.
Yeah.
Because of what the sin that he had done.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was in the back of his mind. Maybe that's, that could be one reason why he didn't say anything.
Yeah, could be.
Because I'm sure that had an effect on him. But regardless if it did or not, he should have done something, but he didn't.
He had a responsibility.
And even like here now too, that verse, he's still, maybe he's still guilty.
Yeah.
For what he had done.
It's very possible that he was a little too merciful because of his own past experience.
But the sickness of what Amnon did, to me, is almost like, how could you not do something? Because I would be worried about what other things he would be doing. Like, he obviously has to.
Yeah.
He's obviously.
Well, some manuscripts, and apparently it's almost unanimously agreed to be rightfully taken out of the text, excuse me, not taken out, but kept out. In verse 21, adds, and your Bible might have a footnote. It's in the Septuagint and in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that after it says, when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. It adds, but he wouldn't punish his son Amnon because he loved him since he was his firstborn. Now that, like I said, maybe that's true. Very well could be true. But the general consensus is that was sort of added by some copyist at some point to sort of help to make a clarification or help it to explain. But it was not part of the inspired text, and so it was added to it and then taken back from it, and that's why you won't find but maybe one or two very fringe, for lack of a better word. No mainstream Bible versions have that. The rest of have that sentence in verse 21. But there obviously was some reason David didn't do anything to Amnon. We know he didn't. The why of why he didn't is we'll just have to leave that one unanswered. So the sheep shearing celebration is all planned. He has succeeded. Amnon's coming. Then he goes to his servants and he says, all right, here's what's going on. You mark when Amnon is drunk, and then when I say to you, you kill him. Pay attention to Amnon, and when he's good and drunk, you wait for my command, and then you're going to kill him. So basically the plan is get him drunk and kill him. Why does he have to be drunk first? I don't know. I guess because why not make it easier? But at any rate, that was the plan, and it was a successful plan. They did exactly as he said. And it says, then all the king's sons, remember all the brothers were there too. All the king's sons were there. Absalom didn't care that they were there. The only reason that he even did this, put this thing together, even though it was a custom, on this particular occasion, the only thing he cared about was getting Amnon there so he could kill him. So for 2 years he was lying in wait. Now he has executed vengeance in the absence of justice, which is another lesson we're going to learn in a few minutes. He executed vengeance on his brother Amnon for what he did to his sister Tamar. All the other brothers, they run away. After all, they I guess don't know why he's killing and why this happened to him, so they probably think they are targets too. So they take off. And news came to David that Absalom's killed all the sons. And so David arose and he tore his garments, he lay on the earth. All his servants did the same thing. But Jonadab, remember Jonadab? The old playboy, slick creep that came up with that plot for Amnon. He pops up again and he puts it together. He figures it out what this was. And he says to David, no, don't worry. It's only Amnon that's dead. See, he knew. How do you know that? He didn't. We hadn't seen him since he told Amnon about the plot that would work. Now he pops up. He somehow has put all this together, and he realizes Absalom's gotten his revenge, and he didn't kill everybody. He just killed Amnon, because he says this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Absalom, Jonadab knew now he's been waiting for this moment since the day that happened. And while he was still saying this, pretty much, here they come, or sometime after that, the rest of the sons come back, and he says, see, I was right. There they are. Don't be sad, O king. Only one of your sons has been killed. Like that would be such a great comfort, but I guess it would in a sense, but at the same time, his firstborn, Amnon, has been murdered.
I guess he wasn't going to tell David that he encouraged Amnon to do it.
Yeah, he didn't mention that part.
He came up with a plan.
It's like, he just left that part out. Because he was crafty. And a crafty man's not going to make an amateur mistake like that. Mention that. He's happy with that part staying 2 years ago. But he was okay with knowing something that other people hadn't put together yet. But all this tragedy, Absalom, however, he runs away. He runs away, it says in verse 37. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, for 3 years. Does anybody, why would Absalom flee to Geshur? What's that? Talmai was his grandfather. His mom's dad is who this man was. The king of Geshur was his grandfather on his mother's side. He ran to granddad. That's what he's done. The reason he would flee, at all is obvious, He was a murderer. He's going to flee. He was also the perpetrator of a premeditated act of murder. So that means the cities of refuge do not apply to him. He can't. So that's why he would flee from Israel, outside Israel. The reason he would flee is because he was murdered. The reason he would flee out of Israel is because he was premeditated. But the reason he would flee to Geshur is because that's where his granddad was king. So that is a little, it's not mentioned there in verse 37, but we do know from whenever we look at his mother, she is called the son of Talmai, the king of Geshur. So that's his grandfather. He stayed there for 3 years, okay? Now, his story continues from chapters 14 to 18, and it doesn't get any better. In fact, Absalom, 3 years in Geshur he's not seeking any sort of forgiveness per se, maybe in a superficial manner, but he stays in Geshur for 3 years, and David is just torn up. Yes, go ahead.
I see on the screen where you have David work for his son day after day. So, and then when you follow up with verse 39, is that saying that he was mourning for Amnon? Or
Verse 39 is very confusing.
Well, in conjunction with that part in 30. Yeah, in 37. So is he mourning for Absalom or Amnon?
I'm not sure about 37. I honestly am inclined to think it is a reference to Absalom more than Amnon.
That's what I had always thought, but then when you just said that about that little...
Yeah, 39 is confusing, and for a couple of reasons. Number one is the verb longed to, because it also, the footnote in my Bible says, one of the old versions says ceased to instead of longed to, which is two totally different ideas. Well, did David cease to go after Absalom or out to Absalom, or did he want to go out to Absalom? That makes a big difference. I mean, that's two totally different ideas. The other is the verb go out. And that verb go out apparently means in a hostile way. Like in Deuteronomy 28:7, that same verb is used, and the idea is apparently go out to go after, to capture and punish. So that just opens it up even more to, like, if you just mix and match those two options. It could mean that David longed to go out to capture Absalom, to punish him, or that he ceased to go out to capture Absalom, to punish him. Or it could mean that he longed to go out to him in a fatherly way, or that he no longer went out after him to get him to embrace him in a fatherly way. So I don't know. I don't know which one is intended, and the rest of the verse doesn't help me very much because I can't even make sense of it in my mind that any of those options would be because he was comforted that Amnon was dead. So, at any rate, the picture that we're left with is Absalom flees to Geshur, and David mourns for him. And he would be mourning for both of them every day. But I think, like we said, he probably feels guilty that this happened. He feels guilty for Absalom and Amnon, because guess why this happened in the first place? Why did Absalom kill Amnon? Because David didn't do anything, but especially because David didn't do what he should have done. He did not act in a judicial manner. He did not do anything to Amnon, so this festered with Absalom, and that David's negligence tempted and really spurred Absalom on to do this to Amnon.
Well, David's negligence led to the whole thing in the first place.
Yeah.
Because he could have said, like you said, no, that's a completely unreasonable request. That's not happening.
Yeah. And if he had been...
His guilt in it would not have been as great, because
he could have done something.
I mean, Amnon may have still succeeded, but David would not have been at least responsible for that part.
Yeah. And if it was as bad as, if Amnon's infatuation was as bad as it seemed to have been, he should have known. I mean, he was making himself sick over it. I don't think it would take a genius of psychology to realize that something was weird about Amnon and his view of Tamar. But anyway, we know what kind of heart David had, and I can't help but think that when this happened, David, his first thought was probably, I've done this. This is my fault, at least in part. So Absalom is in Geshur for 3 years, and Joab now comes into play. And when we looked at Abner a couple weeks ago, remember Abner was Saul's right-hand man, King Saul? Joab was David's right-hand man. So Abner to Saul, Joab was David's Abner. So Joab now, who had his own issues and wasn't the greatest, honorable, virtuous man, but he's going to help to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, to his father. But not without some plotting. But he gets this woman to tell this fake parable, almost just like Nathan's parable, except God sent Nathan to David about Bathsheba, and he said there was a man, and he had, this one sheep, his lamb that he loved so much, it was like a daughter to him. It ate from his own table. This rich man across the street or whatever had all kinds of sheep, and he had a guest come over, so he needed to kill a sheep, slaughter a sheep, and instead of slaughtering one of his own many sheep, he goes and steals his neighbor's sheep, little lamb, and kills it for his guest. And he says, what ought to be done to that man? Remember that? David said, that man ought to be put to death. And then Nathan said, you're that man. Because it wasn't about sheep at all. It was about women. And David took Bathsheba from Uriah and more than that. Well, Joab's going to try to pull that same stunt to trick David into vowing and swearing to let Absalom come back unharmed without even mentioning Absalom. That's a heavy task. But it almost works. In fact, it does work. The woman gets so far as to get David to swear by Jehovah that her son, that she doesn't have, will be allowed to come back and nothing will happen to him. Well, guess what? Her son was Absalom. So he has sworn without knowing that Absalom will be able to come back untouched. But then he figures it out. He said, and not only did he figure out that she was making this up, he figured out that Joab had something to do with it. He said, wait a minute, is Joab helping you in this? So Absalom gets to come home, but then we read in verse 24, it says, so Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence for 2 full years. Forgot to throw the map up there, but we're already past that, so you can just watch that and enjoy that, I guess. But 2 years again. So Absalom gets to come back. He's in the royal city. He does not speak to his father. He's never summoned by his father. There's no big reunion where they're hugging and, just love you, missed you so much, and let's just put the past behind. None of that. He gets to come home. He doesn't get to see his father for 2 years, and he's getting fed up. An ambitious man like Absalom, this is unacceptable to him. So he goes to Joab, and this is where we learn he apparently was the most handsome man in the country. He was on the cover of GQ magazine back then, one of the early editions of GQ magazine over in Israel. And it said he had apparently a head of hair that was something to behold, and it's going to come back to haunt him. In fact, if you noticed, I'm sure you did, Herbert Lockyer named him the man whose lovely hair meant his death. But he had a huge head of hair, apparently massive, and his charm with his looks and his head of hair, all this was just a recipe for, he just could influence anybody. I tell you one person he couldn't influence, though, was Joab. If anybody's going to not care anything about good looks and a man's charm, it's Joab. Okay? Rough, rugged soldier type man's man. So guess what? Joab is not answering Absalom's calls. So you know what Absalom does? He goes and sets his fields on fire. That'll get his attention, won't it? Not going to answer my phone calls? I'll just go and set your house on fire. Then you'll have to come out and talk to me. Or, that'll get your attention. Well, it works. He burns Joab's barley field. He says, I want to see my father. I want to go before the king. Whatnot. Then they have their reunion. Well, it wasn't because of some great love for his father that he wanted that. It's because he was an ambitious little twerp. He's wanting to plot and scheme, and he can't plot and scheme when he can't see the king, and when Joab won't answer his calls and he's not in the circles of influence. He needs to get out there. Now he starts to plot, and guess what he's going to end up doing? Long story short, since we're running out of time, he's plotting to steal his dad's throne. Wasn't enough that he killed his son, who would have been the heir, I guess, as far as he was concerned, as the firstborn. Now he's going to plot to steal the throne. Now, it seems maybe he did have some more festering hatred in him for his dad. Maybe he blamed, it's never really explicitly said, but maybe he did blame his dad for a lot of what happened. Jonadab's lucky that Absalom didn't find out about his part. I think that's pretty clear. A little punk like Jonadab wouldn't have any chance with a guy like Absalom. But he plots. He starts to go out to the gate of the city. Why was the gate of the city back then, their city, so important? Okay. Well, yeah, that would be one. Yeah. What took place at the gates, the city gates, or the entry, or whatever you want to call it? That was like the I want to say the McDonald's or the Hardee's every morning. Everywhere I've ever been, there's a group of old men that meet at Hardee's or McDonald's for breakfast every morning. Same group, every day. And that's their place, that's their realm. They meet and they talk about their stuff. That was the city gates of any ancient city. In Israel especially, that's where all the talking took place. If you wanted to learn things, you go to the gates. That area. this is where Absalom started going. Every day, he was politicking. He's going around, smiling at everybody, doing the fingers point, how's the wife and kids, Just like a politician. And for the same reasons. He's trying to win people. He wants people to love him, to follow him. He wants to plant that seed in people's minds that Absalom's the kind of guy I could really get behind. I could follow him. And he did it. He succeeded. And it gets to the point, I'm just going to fast forward here, that David is scared of his own son. And he goes down to Hebron. Absalom goes down to Hebron, which is right here. And David's still in Jerusalem, and they start to put some things together, and David realizes, when my son comes back, we're in big trouble. He's got a force behind him, and he's going to run us out. So David then has to flee from his own royal city, and it's like Saul all over again. He's running, except now he wasn't the future king, he was the king, and he's running from Absalom. So guess what? Now Absalom gets to just be, he's acting king now. I'm the big bad king. Kings run away. I got more people, on my side. And so, great. Everything's great. Until it wasn't. Absalom goes out. David sends out his army. And he commanded Joab and some others to deal gently with Absalom. See, David still sort of takes a lot of the blame. He doesn't want anything to happen to him. Deal gently with him at least. 20,000 men died in battle that day. This is chapters 18 and 19. Absalom runs into Joab and the other two soldiers. He runs away and he gets himself caught in a tree. Guess how he got caught in that tree? That long head of hair. By the way, they said if they cut his hair off, it weighed 2 pounds. 2-something pounds by our measurements. That's a lot of hair. Yeah, every year. And I got a feeling that kind of thick hair may not, I don't know about in the Middle East, but in the Far East at least it wouldn't be very common, but in the Middle East maybe a little more common, but not like he had it. Well, that hair got him in trouble. Now he's stuck in a tree. Well, guess what? Joab comes. Remember that order that he was given? Joab said, yeah, I don't really care. Kills him. David is torn apart, and he cries out. He went to the gate and wept. Guess what's going to be at the gate? A lot of people. Goes to the gate, weeps. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you. Very quickly. Run through these lessons. Our chief glory can become the cause of our greatest shame. In Absalom's case, that was a few different things. But his hair. Same thing for number 2. Our choicest endowments and most cherished gifts can become our greatest temptations. In that case, Absalom's general personality and charm. He had some gifts, personality gifts that were, could have been such blessings for good, but he didn't use them for good. He used them for evil. Our gifts, like ourselves, need to be rewashed every day in the fountain of God's truth and guarded and sanctified by prayer if they are to be fit for the highest service. That goes for any gift or talent, trait that we have. Number 4, a man should not let his role outside the home detract from his role inside the home. I added that one. That's a reference to David. He was a good king as a rule. He wasn't in Amnon's case. But he didn't show himself to be a very good father, did he? He was kind of aloof. Similarly, number 5, a father should know what's going on in his own household. Number 6, negligence of rightful justice provokes rogue vengeance. Leaders should keep that in mind. Lack of justice is going to result in vengeance. If David had acted as he should have, Absalom would not have been tempted to do what he did. And if Absalom hadn't been built up for that 2 years, none of that other stuff may have happened either after that. Ambition, when unchecked by ethical, moral, and spiritual principles, is a dangerous thing. And finally, Absalom's downfall was due ultimately to a lack of applying the principles of Romans 12, 17 through 21, which says, repay no one evil for evil. If possible, live peaceably with all. Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. And do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, obviously, Absalom didn't have Romans 12, but those principles, Paul didn't, say those things like those principles for the first time ever. But that was a principle of God. And if Absalom had, done any one of these things, it would have gone a long way. But again, Absalom has no excuse for what he did, but if David had done as he should, Absalom's that hate, that bitterness would not have festered in him for 2 years, and he would not. There should have been no Amnon for Absalom to murder, because David should have seen to Amnon's departure from this earth for what he did. But he didn't. So his negligence played a huge role in this.